My name is Thomas Tommy Grayson. I was a corporal in the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, during the Vietnam War. I went to Vietnam in 1968 when I was just 20 years old. Before the war, I was a farm boy from Iowa. Quiet life, nothing much happened there. I figured the Army would be my way out, my way to see the world. I got my orders right after basic training, and before I knew it, I was in a Huey helicopter flying over a jungle thicker than anything I'd ever seen back home. The place we were stationed at first was near a small village in the Quang Tri province, up near the DMZ. It was hot, muggy, and the kind of quiet that made you feel like something bad was always about to happen. You could smell the war in the air, smoke, diesel, and the rot of the jungle. We called the area the Valley of the Shadow because no one who went in there seemed to come out unscathed. Our company was tasked with securing the valley and clearing out any Viet Cong forces that were using it as a supply route. The brass thought it was a simple mission, but nothing in Vietnam was ever simple. We had M16 rifles, a few M26 grenades, and enough rations to last us a week. That was it. The jungle made everything harder, visibility, movement, even breathing sometimes. I'll never forget the first night. We set up a perimeter, dug in, and tried to get some rest. The jungle had this way of making you feel like you were being watched. Every sound, crickets, frogs, even the wind felt like it could be something else. Something dangerous. That's when I met Charlie Doc Rivers, our platoon's medic. Doc was from Louisiana, a wiry guy with a thick Cajun accent. He was stitching up one of the guys who'd cut his hand on a piece of bamboo. Doc had this way of making you feel calm, even when you were scared out of your mind. We got to talking, and he told me, "Tommy, you keep your head on straight. You might just make it out of here in one piece." I didn't know if he was trying to reassure me or himself. The first few days were uneventful. We patrolled the jungle, cutting through the underbrush and sweating buckets under the weight of our gear. But then we found it, a small camp hidden deep in the trees. It was abandoned, but you could tell it hadn't been for long. There were cooking pots, still warm, AK-47 rounds scattered on the ground, and what looked like a map carved into the dirt. Our lieutenant, Lieutenant Carson, took one look and ordered us to fan out and search the area. That's when things started to go wrong. I was with Doc and a guy named Jimmy Vargas, a kid from New Jersey who never stopped talking about home. We were about 50 yards from the rest of the platoon when we heard the first explosion. A claymore mine, hidden under a patch of leaves, went off about 10 feet from us. Jimmy was hit bad. Shrapnel tore through his legs. Doc jumped into action, pulling Jimmy behind a tree and wrapping a tourniquet around his thigh. I covered them with my M16, scanning the jungle for any sign of the enemy. "Stay with me, Jimmy," Doc kept saying. "You're gonna be fine. Just stay with me." That's when I saw them. 2 Viet Cong soldiers, barely visible through the dense foliage, moving toward us. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I fired a burst from my M16, and one of them dropped. The other one vanished like a ghost. We managed to get Jimmy back to the platoon, but by then, it was clear we were in trouble. The Viet Cong had us surrounded, and they knew the terrain better than we ever could. Lieutenant Carson tried to radio for air support, but the jungle canopy was so thick that the Hueys couldn't see us. We were on our own. That night was the longest of my life. We could hear them moving around us, whispering to each other in Vietnamese, and every now and then, we'd hear the click of a claymore arming. Nobody slept. We just sat there in the dark, fingers on our triggers, waiting for the attack we knew was coming. At around 3 a.m., they hit us. Bullets ripped through the trees, and the jungle lit up like the 4th of July. I remember firing blindly into the darkness, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold the rifle steady. Doc was dragging wounded guys back to the center of the perimeter, his face set in this grim determination. Lieutenant Carson was shouting orders, trying to keep everyone from panicking, but it was chaos. Then, out of nowhere, I heard this loud, high-pitched whistle. It took me a second to realize what it was: a mortar. It hit about 20 feet from where I was crouched, sending dirt and shrapnel flying. I felt something slam into my shoulder and realized I'd been hit. The pain was white-hot, like someone had pressed a branding iron against my skin. I dropped my rifle and fell back, clutching at the wound. Doc was there in an instant. "You're not dying on me, Tommy," he said, his voice steady even as the firefight raged around us. He patched me up as best he could, then handed me my rifle. "You still got a fight in you?" he asked. I nodded, gritting my teeth against the pain. "Yeah," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." And I didn't. The fight that night felt like it lasted forever. The jungle was alive with gunfire, and every shadow seemed like it was moving. I don't even know how many rounds I fired. All I could think about was staying alive and keeping the guys around me alive too. Doc was everywhere, patching up wounded men, dragging them to safety, and shouting for more bandages or morphine. He was the glue holding us together. Without him, I don't think any of us would have made it. At some point during the chaos, Lieutenant Carson managed to get the radio working again. I could hear him yelling over the gunfire, trying to call in air support. His voice was steady, but you could tell he was on edge. "This is Bravo Company. We're pinned down and taking heavy fire. We need evac ASAP." It took what felt like hours, but finally we heard the sound of Huey helicopters in the distance. That sound, it was like salvation. The Viet Cong must have heard it too, because their attacks started to let up. They knew they couldn't go toe-to-toe with air support. By the time the Hueys arrived, most of the fighting had stopped. The jungle was quiet again, but it wasn't the kind of quiet you could relax in. It was the kind that made your skin crawl. We loaded the wounded onto the helicopters first. Jimmy was still alive, but just barely. Doc stayed with him, refusing to leave his side. I remember standing there, watching the Hueys take off, and feeling this weird mix of relief and dread. We'd survived the night, but I knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next few days were brutal. We moved deeper into the valley, trying to flush out the Viet Cong, but they were always one step ahead of us. We'd find their camps, empty, like the first one, but they were never far away. You could feel their presence, like they were watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. We lost 2 more guys to booby traps. One was a tripwire connected to a claymore mine. The other was a punji pit, sharp bamboo spikes covered in feces to cause infection. That one got a guy named Daniels. He was from Texas, always talking about how he was going to open a barbecue joint when he got back home. Doc did what he could, but Daniels didn't make it. It hit all of us hard, but especially Document. He didn't say much after that, just kept to himself. I think he felt like he should have been able to save Daniels, even though there was nothing anyone could have done. A few days later, we got orders to hold a ridge overlooking the valley. The brass thought it was a key strategic point, but to us it just felt like a death trap. The ridge was exposed with barely any cover, and the jungle below was crawling with Viet Cong. Still, orders were orders, so we dug in and prepared for the worst. That night, the fog rolled in thick. You couldn't see more than a few feet in front of you. It was eerie, like the jungle was swallowing us whole. I was on watch with a guy named Harris, a big, quiet guy from Montana. We were sitting in our foxhole, scanning the darkness, when we heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the jungle. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Harris nodded, his grip tightening on his M16. "Yeah, stay sharp." The rustling got louder, and then we saw them, shadows moving through the fog. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. I raised my rifle, ready to fire, but Harris grabbed my arm. "Wait," he said. "It might be one of ours." We called out, "Identify yourself." No response. The shadows kept moving closer. "Last warning," I shouted. Still nothing. Then, all hell broke loose. A burst of AK-47 fire ripped through the fog, and Harris went down. I didn't even think. I just started firing. The rest of the platoon woke up fast, and soon the ridge was lit up with gunfire and explosions. I was running on pure adrenaline, firing at anything that moved. When I saw it, one of the Viet Cong soldiers, no more than 10 feet away, leveling his rifle at me. Time seemed to slow down. I raised my M16, but he fired first. I felt a searing pain in my side and fell to the ground. Everything went blurry, and for a moment I thought that was it. I was done. But then Doc was there, pulling me behind a rock and pressing a bandage against my wound. "Stay with me, Tommy," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "You're not checking out on me, you hear?" I nodded, biting down on the pain. "I'm not going anywhere," I managed to say, though it felt like every word took all the strength I had. The fight lasted all night. By the time it was over, The ridge was littered with bodies, ours and theirs. The sun rose, casting an eerie light over the carnage. We'd held the ridge, but it didn't feel like a victory. It just felt like survival. When the sun came up that morning, I looked around and felt a deep, hollow kind of exhaustion. Harris was gone, along with a couple of other guys. We'd taken heavy losses, but the brass called it a successful operation because we held the ridge. I didn't feel successful. None of us did. Doc was sitting off to the side, covered in blood that wasn't all his own. His hands were shaking, and he was staring down at them like he didn't recognize them anymore. I wanted to say something, but what could I say? Thanks for saving my life. Didn't feel like enough. The wounded were evacuated first. I was one of them. My side was bandaged, but the pain hadn't gone away. As I climbed into the Huey, I looked back at the ridge and felt this strange pull like I was leaving a part of myself behind. Some of the guys stayed to hold the position, but most of us were rotated out to a fire base a few miles away to regroup and recover. The fire base was a world away from the jungle. It had sandbags, barbed wire, and even a small mess hall. It wasn't exactly comfortable, but it felt safer than the valley. At least there, you could see the enemy coming. I spent a couple of weeks there, resting and trying to get my strength back. The wound in my side wasn't bad enough to send me home, but it was enough to keep me out of action for a while. That time gave me a lot of space to think, maybe too much. I kept replaying the fight on the ridge in my head. The sounds, the smells, the faces. Harris's face. One night, I was sitting outside the barracks, staring up at the stars. Doc came over and sat down next to me. He didn't say anything at first, just lit a cigarette and handed it to me. "You okay?" he finally asked. I shrugged. "I don't know. Are you?" He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Hell no," he said. "But I guess that's normal, right? Nobody comes out of this thing okay." We sat there in silence for a while, passing the cigarette back and forth. It was the closest thing to peace I'd felt in months. A couple of days later, we got new orders. The Viet Cong had been moving supplies through a series of tunnels not far from our firebase, and it was our job to shut them down. I'd heard stories about those tunnels, how they stretched for miles and were booby-trapped to hell and back. The thought of going into one made my stomach turn, but orders were orders. We moved out at dawn. The jungle was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that made you feel like something was watching you. Our point man, Rodriguez, was a wiry guy from San Diego with a sixth sense for danger. He carried a shotgun instead of an M16, said it was better for close quarters. We found the first tunnel entrance at around midday. It was hidden under a thick layer of leaves and dirt, barely big enough for a man to crawl through. Lieutenant Carson looked at it, then at the rest of us. "Grayson, Rodriguez, you're up," he said. I felt my stomach drop. Going into that dark, claustrophobic hole was the last thing I wanted to do, but I didn't have a choice. I nodded, checked my gear, and followed Rodriguez into the tunnel. The air inside was stale and heavy, like the jungle had been holding its breath. The only light came from the flashlight mounted on my rifle, and even that didn't seem to cut through the darkness. The walls were damp and lined with roots, and the ground was soft under my hands and knees. We crawled forward slowly, our weapons ready. Every sound seemed amplified. The rustle of our gear, the scrape of my boots against the dirt, the pounding of my own heartbeat. Rodriguez stopped suddenly, holding up a hand. I froze, my finger hovering over the trigger. He pointed ahead, and I saw it, a tripwire stretched across the tunnel. "Claymore," he whispered. "Careful." He pulled out a pair of wire cutters and disarmed it with practiced ease. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. We kept moving deeper into the tunnel. The air got heavier, and the walls seemed to close in around us. My hands were sweating so much I could barely keep my grip on my rifle. Then we heard it, voices speaking in low, urgent tones. Rodriguez turned to me and mouthed, "Viet Cong." We moved forward slowly, careful not to make a sound. The tunnel opened up into a small chamber, and there they were, 3 Viet Cong soldiers sitting around a radio. They hadn't seen us yet. Rodriguez raised his shotgun, and I followed suit with my M16. We opened fire at the same time, the sound deafening in the confined space. 2 of them went down immediately, but the third managed to grab his rifle and fire back. The bullet grazed my arm, and I felt a sharp, stinging pain. I fired again, and he went down. The chamber fell silent, except for the ringing in my ears. Rodriguez checked the bodies to make sure they were dead, then turned to me. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, though my arm was throbbing. We searched the chamber and found a stash of supplies. AK-47s, grenades, and even some documents. Rodriguez stuffed the papers into his pack, and we headed back the way we came. By the time we crawled out of the tunnel, the sun was starting to set. The rest of the platoon was waiting for us, their faces tense with anticipation. "What did you find?" Lieutenant Carson asked. Rodriguez handed him the documents. "Looks like supply routes and troop movements," he said. "Could be useful." The lieutenant nodded, a small smile breaking through his usual stoic expression. "Good work," he said. That night, as I lay in my bunk, I couldn't stop thinking about the tunnel, about how close we'd come to dying down there, about the look on the face of the Viet Cong soldier I'd shot. It wasn't anger or fear. It was just blank. I didn't sleep much that night. The days after the tunnel mission were a blur. The documents we'd found were handed off to intelligence, and we got word that they'd uncovered a major supply route used by the Viet Cong. It felt like a win, but it didn't change much for us on the ground. We were still stuck in the jungle, still fighting an enemy we could barely see. The thing about Vietnam was that it got into your head. It wasn't just the danger or the heat or the bugs. It was the waiting. The long stretches of quiet where you didn't know if the next step you took would be your last. Every sound made you jump. Every shadow looked like it could kill you. Doc said it best one night when we were sitting around the fire. "It's not the fighting that gets to you," he said, poking at the embers with a stick. "It's the not knowing. It's the thinking." I nodded, staring into the flames. "Yeah," I said. "It's like the jungle's alive, and it's playing with us." He didn't say anything after that, just kept poking at the fire. A week later, we got orders to move out again. This time, our mission was to secure a small village that had been taken over by the Viet Cong. The villagers were being used as human shields, and our job was to get them out and neutralize the enemy. The village was about 10 clicks away, and the march there was brutal. The jungle was so thick that sometimes we had to hack our way through with machetes. The air was heavy with the smell of rotting vegetation, and the mosquitoes were relentless. By the time we reached the outskirts of the village, we were exhausted. Lieutenant Carson called us into a huddle and laid out the plan. We'd split into 3 groups. One would circle around to cut off any escape routes, another would provide covering fire, and the third, my group, would go in and evacuate the villagers. "Keep your heads down and watch your corners," he said. "And remember, those villagers are not the enemy. Be careful." We nodded, checked our weapons, and moved out. The village was small, just a handful of thatched huts clustered together in a clearing. As we approached, I could see the fear in the villagers' eyes. They were huddled together in the center of the village, guarded by a handful of Viet Cong soldiers. Rodriguez was with me again, along with Doc and a couple of other guys. We moved in slowly, using the huts for cover. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the adrenaline surging through my veins. Rodriguez was the first to make contact. He took out one of the guards with a single, well-placed shot from his shotgun. The rest of us opened fire immediately, and the clearing erupted into chaos. The Viet Cong weren't expecting us, but they recovered quickly. They ducked behind the huts and started firing back. I could hear the villagers screaming, their voices cutting through the gunfire. "Go, go, go!" Doc shouted, motioning for me and Rodriguez to move toward the villagers. We sprinted across the clearing, bullets kicking up dirt around our feet. I dropped to my knees in front of the villagers and motioned for them to follow me. "Come on," I shouted. "We're here to help." They hesitated, their eyes wide with fear. I didn't blame them. To them, we probably looked just as terrifying as the Viet Cong. Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We're getting you out of here," he said. "Trust us." That seemed to do the trick. The villagers started to move, clinging to each other as they followed us toward the edge of the clearing. Behind us, the firefight was still raging. I could see Doc dragging a wounded soldier behind one of the huts, his face set in that grim determination I'd come to know so well. Just as we were about to reach the tree line, I heard a sharp crack and felt something slam into my leg. I went down hard, the pain shooting through me like fire. Rodriguez was there in an instant, grabbing me under the arms and dragging me behind a tree. "You're not dying on me, Grayson," he said, his voice tight with effort. "I'm fine," I grunted, though the pain was almost unbearable. "Just get the villagers out of here." He nodded and ran back to help the others, leaving me behind the tree. I pressed my hand against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, and scanned the clearing for any sign of the enemy. That's when I saw him, a Viet Cong soldier, no more than 15 feet away, leveling his rifle at Rodriguez. Without thinking, I raised my M16 and fired. The soldier went down, but not before he got off a shot. Rodriguez stumbled, clutching his side, but he didn't stop. He kept moving, herding the villagers toward the safety of the jungle. By the time the fight was over, the village was secure and the villagers were safe. We'd lost a couple of men, and a few more, including me and Rodriguez, were wounded, but we'd done our job. Doc patched me up as best he could, his hand steady despite the chaos around us. "You're lucky," he said. "It went clean through. You'll be limping for a while, but you'll live." I nodded, too tired to say much. That night, as we sat around a small fire on the outskirts of the village, I couldn't stop thinking about the look on the faces of the villagers as we'd led them to safety. It wasn't fear anymore, it was hope. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we'd actually made a difference. But the jungle wasn't done with us yet. The days after the village rescue were a strange mix of relief and tension. We'd done something good, something we could actually feel proud of, but none of us were naive enough to think we were safe. The jungle didn't let you forget. Rodriguez was still moving slow from the bullet wound in his side, but he refused to sit out. "I'm not letting you guys have all the fun without me," he said, grinning like nothing had happened. That was Rodriguez for you, always finding a way to lighten the mood, even when things were at their worst. Doc, on the other hand, was quieter than usual. He spent most of his time checking and rechecking his supplies, making sure he had enough bandages, morphine, and whatever else he might need. I think the village fight had shaken him more than he let on. Our next mission came sooner than expected. Intel from the documents we'd recovered from the tunnel pointed to a supply cache deep in enemy territory. It was supposed to be a big one: ammo, medical supplies, maybe even explosives. The brass wanted it destroyed, and they wanted us to do it. We moved out at first light. The jungle was dense, the kind of dense where every step felt like it took twice as much effort. The air was thick with humidity, and the smell of wet earth was overwhelming. About 2 hours into the march, we came across a small stream. Lieutenant Carson called for a break, and we all dropped our packs and knelt by the water to refill our canteens. It was quiet, too quiet. I was kneeling next to Rodriguez when I heard it, a faint rustling in the underbrush. My hand went to my rifle instinctively, and I scanned the trees, my heart pounding. "You hear that?" I whispered. He nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Yeah, stay sharp." The rustling got louder, and then it stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then the jungle exploded. Gunfire erupted from all sides, and the air was filled with the deafening cracks of AK-47s and the sharp pops of our M16s. I dove behind a fallen log, my hands shaking as I returned fire. "Ambush!" someone shouted, but we already knew. The Viet Cong had us pinned down, their fire coming from every direction. It was like they were part of the jungle itself, invisible until it was too late. Rodriguez was firing like a madman, his shotgun booming with every pull of the trigger. "We gotta move," he yelled over the noise. But there was nowhere to go. Lieutenant Carson was barking orders, trying to get us organized, but the ambush had thrown us into chaos. Men were yelling, bullets were flying, and the jungle felt like it was closing in around us. I don't know how long the fight lasted. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. Time didn't seem to matter. All I knew was that we were outnumbered and outgunned. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the sound of a Huey. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw it, a helicopter coming in low, its rotor blades slicing through the air. The Viet Cong must have seen it too, because their fire started to let up. "Air support," Lieutenant Carson shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Hold your positions." The Huey swooped in, its door gunners opening up with their M60s. The jungle lit up with tracer rounds, and the Viet Cong scattered. By the time the firefight was over, the jungle was eerily quiet again. The Hueys circled back, hovering just above the treetops as we regrouped. We'd taken heavy losses. A few of the guys didn't make it, and several more were wounded, including Document. He'd taken a round in the arm while dragging one of the wounded to cover. Even then, he refused to stop working. "I'm fine," he said, waving off the medic who tried to patch him up. "Take care of the others first." That was Document, always putting everyone else before himself. Once the wounded were stabilized, we moved out again, slower this time. The ambush had shaken us, but we couldn't turn back. The supply cache was still out there, and we had a job to do. We reached the cache just before sunset. It was hidden in a small clearing, surrounded by thick jungle. There were a few Viet Cong guards, but they weren't expecting us. We took them out quickly and secured the area. The cache was bigger than we'd expected. Crates of ammo, medical supplies, and enough explosives to level a city block. Lieutenant Carson set up a perimeter while Rodriguez and I rigged the explosives. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every little sound made me jump. "You feel that?" I asked Rodriguez, keeping my voice low. He nodded, his face tense. "Yeah, they're out there." We finished rigging the explosives and set the timer for 5 minutes. "Let's move," Lieutenant Carson ordered. We fell back into the jungle, moving as quickly as we could without making too much noise. The explosion came just as we reached a safe distance, lighting up the sky and sending a shockwave through the ground. For a moment, the jungle was completely silent. Then the sounds of the night returned. Crickets, distant animal calls, the rustle of leaves in the wind. We didn't stop to celebrate. We knew the explosion would draw attention, and we needed to get out of there before the Viet Cong showed up in force. The march back to the firebase was long and grueling. We were all exhausted, our nerves frayed from the ambush and the tension of the mission. But we'd done it. We completed our objective and lived to tell the tale. That night, as I lay in my bunk, I thought about the guys we'd lost, about the look on Doc's face as he worked to save them, even when he was bleeding himself. The jungle had taken a lot from us, but it hadn't taken everything. Not yet. By the time we made it back to the firebase, the sun was starting to rise. The light cut through the mist hanging over the jungle, and for a brief moment, it felt like we'd made it out of hell. We limped through the gates, the guards giving us nods of respect. They didn't say anything, didn't have to. They could see it on our faces, in the way we moved. They knew. Doc went straight to the med tent to get his arm looked at, but not before checking on the other wounded. That man had more heart than anyone I've ever met. Rodriguez slapped him on the back as he passed. "You're too damn stubborn to go down, huh?" Doc just smiled, tired but still standing. We spent the next few days licking our wounds. The cache we destroyed had been a major win, but the cost was high. For guys didn't come back, and their absence was a weight that hung over the whole firebase. I kept thinking about one of them, Private Jenkins. He was just a kid, barely 19. He used to talk about how he was going to open a diner when he got back home. "Best pancakes in the state," he'd say with this big grin on his face. I didn't have the heart to tell him I'd never had much of a sweet tooth. Now he'd never get the chance. One night, a few of us were sitting around a makeshift fire, passing around a can of beer that someone had managed to smuggle in. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy. Rodriguez broke it. "You ever wonder if we'll make it out of here?" Nobody answered right away. It wasn't the kind of question you wanted to say out loud. Finally, Doc spoke up. "If we do, it's because we've got each other's backs." He looked at each of us in turn, his eyes steady despite the weariness in them. "That's all we can do. Watch out for each other. That's how we get home." It wasn't much, but it was enough. A few weeks later, I got my orders to go home. My tour was up, and I was being rotated out. Part of me was relieved, but another part of me felt like I was abandoning the guys. Rodriguez gave me a hard time about it, of course. "Don't forget about us when you're back stateside, living it up with all the pretty girls," he said, smirking. "Pretty sure the girls will prefer a guy who doesn't smell like jungle rot." I shot back, grinning despite the lump in my throat. Doc just gave me a handshake and a nod. "Take care of yourself, Grayson," he said. You've earned it. Leaving was harder than I thought it would be. As the chopper lifted off, I looked down at the firebase, at the guys still down there, fighting a war that didn't seem to have an end. When I got back to the States, it was like stepping into a different world. The noise of the city, the smell of asphalt, the sight of people going about their lives like nothing had happened. It was jarring. But the jungle stayed with me. It's still with me. Even now, all these years later. I think about the guys all the time. Rodriguez, Doc Jenkins, Lieutenant Carson. I wonder if they made it out, if they found some kind of peace. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the jungle. The rustle of leaves, the buzz of insects, the distant echo of gunfire. But then I remember Doc's words, we've got each other's backs. And that's what I hold on to. Because no matter how far I've come, no matter how much time has passed, those bonds, those memories, are the one thing the jungle couldn't take.